All right, welcome back to the Transfigured Life. I have a special guest for you all. Yes, it is Dr. Joshua Sijuwade. He is a brilliant scholar, a philosopher. Dr. Joshua, welcome to the channel.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really grateful for you having me. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, no, thank you. And man, I'm behind the scenes. I've been following you, even from the time that you were, in Roman Catholicism, doing a
Yeah.
lot of good work there. But you have something that I've always appreciated about you is just the clarity and the work that you've been doing in regards to the monarchy of the Father, and also, studying Trinitarian theology. And so I'm grateful for the discussion that we'll be having today because you recently dropped an important paper, just pretty much diving into the discussion of do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? And something that I find interesting about that, this has been making rounds all over the internet, as you probably know.
Yeah.
Um, but this seems like it should be a no-brainer, right? But essentially, this is something that we've seen qualifiers for, we've seen all kinds of things, but we want to kind of get a philosophical kind of investigation of it, or maybe I would say an orthodox perspective on the matter. So, have you seen a lot of the discussions about this kind of conversation in question?
Yeah, I have definitely. So something which recently is it's interesting because there was an issue about 9 years ago where
Mhm.
there was a scholar at Wheaton College, if I remember, who sort of had a problem with her department or with the university, and she stated that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. And then there was this outrage, sort of a media outrage about this. And I think
Mhm.
that she was actually removed from her post at Wheaton College, and so it
Oh,
was very big about 9 years ago. Um, and then all of a sudden, it sort of died down. Everyone went back to their sort of respective camps, and then over the past few months, it's sort of just again become a sort
Hmm.
of a very hot topic for a lot of individuals to try and think about, this sort of important question. It's a seems like a no-brainer for a lot of people, but actually it is a very important question that you need to think about because of these
Right.
two very large religions, Christianity being the largest, Islam being the second largest. And then there sort of being a position that some Christians take that actually there is the same worship that's offered to the God in Christianity is also offered to the God in Islam. And so a lot of people push back on that. So I think investigating if this is actually true or not is very important. But yeah, it's definitely been
Hmm.
something which again has sort of just caught a storm again with a lot of people getting involved in the debate.
Right, right. Yeah, good point. Good point. And so let's just dive right in then. So let's start with this idea. Let's hear your position on the on on the front end, right?
Yes.
Do Christians and Muslims worship the same God?
So yeah, categorically, I'll say no. They do not worship the same God, and
See.
there's very good reasons, I believe, for someone to hold to that position.
Okay, so you would say no. Now, I know for the most part, the Orthodox would say no. Many Protestants would say no. Roman Catholics say yes. I think some Muslims say no. you
Yeah.
know, so so it seems like our Roman Catholic friends are saying yes, and obviously we have love and respect for them. But I mean, I know you used to dabble in those circles a lot prior. Now, what does I know the Vatican has something to say about that? What does the Vatican say exactly in regards to this matter? Um,
Ye- Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, exactly. So it's authoritative teaching within Roman Catholicism, given Vatican II, which is taken to be an ecumenical council by all Catholics. You might have some people on the sideline who would push back and say, no, it's not. But it is taken officially to be an ecumenical council. So it's authoritative teaching. And it's stated in the council itself, specifically certain conciliar documents, that Christians and Muslims adore the same God. And so adore is sort of another term that you can use for worship. So it's the idea that Christians and Muslims adore the one merciful God. And so these again are, I would say it's very clear as a Catholic that you cannot doubt this position, given the authoritative declaration that's sort of been given here. Some people might push back and say, well, is it infallible teaching or not? But still, you have to understand within Roman Catholicism, you have to give mental assent to authoritative teaching, infallible or not. Maybe the depth of your mental assent would be greater for infallible teaching, but for authoritative teaching, anyways, you have to go and mentally assent to it. So you cannot doubt this and be in right standing with the church, given that this is declared to be the position that Christians, Muslims adore, and you can sort of change that to worship the one and merciful God.
Wow. That's big.
Yeah.
And you would say that this would conflict with the first millennium of Christian history. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, I would. And so the reason why I would do that is because obviously Islam came later in the millennium. It didn't come at the beginning when Christianity was forming and defining some of its key Trinitarian dogmas. So at the Council of Nicaea in 325, and then in Constantinople in 381. There was an Islam to sort of have as a, let's say, intellectual conversation partner. But what we would say very clearly is that God is defined in a certain way in the ecumenical councils. So I would say that the first millennium took the 7 ecumenical councils, stemming from the 4th century to the 8th century, to be the expression of the authoritative teaching of the church. And specifically with the first 2 councils, there was a definition that God, the one God, is the Father. And so any position that goes and denies this has to be saying that they're denying the teaching of Christianity concerning the nature of what or who God is. And so when Islam sort of comes later, in sort of the 6th century and 7th century, you have, I would say, and we can sort of unpack this further, a different teaching about the nature of God, where there's a negation of him being the Father. He doesn't have the property of being the Father because he doesn't eternally generate a son. And so then that goes very explicitly as a contradiction against what the authoritative position of the church is, given the ecumenical councils and also the, I would say, the witness of the church fathers. But then we have later on sort of Christians who are now, who are sort of in the intellectual sphere of Islam, responding to Islam. And so this is the sort of the 7th and 8th century and 9th century. You have people like John of Damascus, a very important saint within the Orthodox Church, but also in the Catholic Church, where he deems Islam a heresy. Yeah. Now, some people push back and say, well, does that mean that he took it as a heresy? So that means that they sharing belief in the same God. But no, because if you understand what a heresy was a negation of revealed teaching. And so the church revealed that God is the Father. And so Arianism, for example, was teaching a different God, because they were saying that God is contingently the Father. And the Nicaeans were saying, no, God is essentially the Father. He essentially begets eternally, and essentially begets the Son. Arius and Eunomius said, no, that there is a creative will that God has where he creates a son. And so you can't say that you're affirming the same being as such, because one is a father essentially, one is contingently a father. They're 2 different beings at the metaphysical level. And so if you just deem Islam, let's say a heresy similar to Arianism, you can't. It is sort of also adopting a position where it is saying that no, you're preaching or you're teaching a God that is different, similar to the Arians and similar to the Eunomians and others.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah. Now I know some people would kind of, the way that they try to work themselves around it is, and you've probably heard all these analogies, right? This idea of like, oh, well, we're looking at we're aiming for the same ideal, but we're just describing it differently or understanding it differently. And we'll kind of try to attribute that to a sense of lack of full revelation, almost as if like, if you and I, for example, let's say, I hate when I try to think of examples off the cuff. I hope this
it's
one
fine.
works.
No worries. Yeah.
But essentially, like if you and I, maybe we were referring to like an architect of a building, right?
Yeah.
And I know him to be some guy named Bob,
Yeah.
and you know him as some guy named Ralph. That would be like maybe 2 different people.
Yeah.
Whereas if maybe you just didn't remember his name, but it actually was Bob or something like that. Like basically this idea of like
Yeah.
we're referring to the same, like they would say like Muslims are probably focusing on this idea of this creator that has made the universe,
Yeah.
and Christians are thinking about a creator as well. However, we have that full understanding, this Trinitarian theology, understanding the Father is actually, a father who begets a son, eternally and things like that. Where as Muslims just don't have that
Yeah.
full
Yeah.
understanding. What would you say to that?
Yeah, so this sort of gets to the meat of the debate, and
Mm.
so I'll need a few minutes to unpack it. So hopefully that's fine.
Okay.
But yeah, so just to give people a little bit of just an overview of the paper that I wrote on this. So
And
I
I'll link it,
first,
by the way.
yeah, thank
Yeah.
you so much. So yeah, when I first sort of tackled the issue, I did it from it was more for length issues more than actually not wanting to go into the philosophy of language. But I sort of was sort of attacking this from a metaphysical point of view, saying no. Well, if we take just sort of unpacking this a little bit more, every entity that exists has something called an essence. So an essence is what it is to be that thing. So, for
Mm.
example, I have this cup here in front of me, and so this cup exists, but even if it didn't exist, it will have an essence. It's just basically what it is to be a cup. Now, normally when it comes to an entity, what it is to be that thing is expressed through something called a real definition. So if I wanted to tell you what it is, for example, to be a human being, someone might go with the Aristotelian definition and say, to be a human being is to be a rational animal. And so what I'm doing in the most conspicuous manner, I'm expressing what it is to be that specific thing. And so, with the essence of something, the essence expresses those things which the entity must have in order to be what it is. So, for example, this cup here it's gray, but it could be red. And so, it's not part of the essence of the cup to be red. It's an accidental property of the cup to be gray, but it could be red, it could be blue, it could be other colors. But something like taking up space or having a certain shape, if I was
Mm.
to crush this down, it will no longer be a cup because the shape of the cup is part of what it is to be a cup. It has to hold fluid. And so the point here is everything that exists, doesn't matter if it's divine or not, has an essence, what it is to be that thing. Now, for Orthodox and also Catholics, when I'm using the term essence here, I'm not using it in sort of the way that we use it when it comes to essence energies distinction. So it's just a different way of using that term. So
Mm.
the term that I'm using is just the philosophical terminology where it means what it is to be that thing, and it's expressed by the real definition. A real definition, just again, expresses in the most conspicuous manner what that thing is. And so what I did with the paper was to say, okay, if we just take the two concepts of God that we have in Christianity and we have in Islam, and we have in Christianity, our sources of authority, I would say, because I really do define Christianity as Orthodox Christianity. And obviously people
Preach.
might push back, but I do take it as that's what is Christianity is. And
Right.
Christianity has three sources of authority as such, if we break it down in that way: the scriptures, the ecumenical councils, and the consensus of the fathers. And these are the three authoritative sources. There are other, let's say, less authoritative sources that we will hold to, but these are the three main ones which define doctrine and practice for the church. And so with these sort of three main sources, I would say that the essence of what it is to be God is to be the uncaused divine person who eternally generates the Son, and also you can add the Spirit. And so to be God is to be that being who is uncaused, is divine, and eternally generates two other divine persons. Okay, so that's
Mm.
what it is to be. So I gave the real definition and expressed the essence of what it is to be God according to Christians. That is according to the scriptures, according to the creeds of the councils, and then according to the consensus of the fathers. And so, in a sort of shorthand way, to be God is to be the Father. Okay, that's
Mm.
what it is. Okay, and to be the Father is to eternally generate the Son, and also you can add the Spirit as well. But then in Islam, we have a different real definition. We have a different understanding of the essence of God. To be to be God in Islam, according to the authoritative sources within Islam, and that would be the Quran, that would be the Hadith. So the Hadith are the written testimonial written documents which express the Sunnah, which is the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. And so you have the Quran, you have the Hadith, and you also have the consensus. Again, it's interesting. You have a consensus as an authority in Islam, which is the consensus of the scholars. And so this is called ijma. And so you have these three levels of authority. And it's very clear in those three authoritative sources that to be God in Islam is to be the uncaused divine person who is undifferentiated. Now, what I mean by undifferentiated is, and it will include within this, I'm just going to shorten it, is to not generate any other divine being. So in Islam, it's very clearly stated in the Quran, in the Hadith, and also the consensus of the scholars that God is not begotten, neither does he beget. That's a very famous verse. And so it's part of the essence of God, not just to be uncaused like the Father is, not just to be divine like the Father is, but also to be undifferentiated in the sense of not eternally bringing about any other divine being. So what we seem to have here are two contradictory real definitions, two contradictory essences. One essence in Christianity is to be God is to be the Father. And to be, or we can make it more clearer, to be God is to be the uncaused divine person who is the Father. And then in Islam, to be God is to be an uncaused divine person who is not the Father. Okay, that just means who doesn't eternally generate, who doesn't beget. And so we have two contradictory essences here. Now, in the first iteration of the paper that I gave, that I put out, I sort of left it at that, and I sort of because I had space requirements at that point. And I sort of left a lot of things implicit. I was trying to basically say, well, of course, if we have two contradictory essences here, how can we be pointing to the same thing? It just seems to be incorrect. But then from feedback that I had from certain individuals, certain philosophers, certain other people that I was in conversation with, they were sort of positioned saying, you need to sort of bring this out in a linguistic level as well with the philosophy of language. So I revised the paper. So it's like a 10,000 word revision, so a very large revision. And I sort of also place in it or bring out a certain understanding of language. Sorry, do stop me if I'm going too long here, because
No.
Okay.
Why? Why would it look like I was zoning out or something?
No, not at all. Sorry, I can just go on for 10 hours.
No, please do. You're a philosopher,
leave
man.
and come back, have a cup of coffee, and I would still just be going. So no, it's just just so I can. I hope I'm not going too long on what I'm saying.
No, you're good. You're good.
Yeah. So the first stage of the paper was just sort of showing that we have these two essences affirmed in these forms of these two Abrahamic, if we say Abrahamic religions. Christianity, where to be God is to be the Father. In Islam, to be God is not to be the Father. So you have these two contradictory essences. Okay. But then there does need to be some work that's done with reference, which is just basically a concept within the philosophy of language. And in the first iteration of the paper, I didn't really bring that out. It was more very, very implicit. But I said, actually, let me be explicit as possible and utilize a certain form of reference to show this. Because what the conciliar documents of Vatican II affirm and commit one to is not really so much that there are two contradictory beings here, because sort of everyone agrees to that. Like no one really believes that the Islamic God is the same ontologically as the Christian God.
Yeah.
But what they're saying is that through our worship practice, through our intentional states, like our beliefs maybe, or our thinking, we can point or we can refer to these two contradictory beings. But really, they're not actually two. We're just pointing to one of them. So the key idea here is, even though at the descriptive level, this is what Catholics will say, at the descriptive level, at the sense level, there is seemingly a contradiction here. One is the Father, one is not the Father. That's just at the descriptive level. But really, in reality, when it comes to our worship practice, or when it comes to our thoughts and our beliefs, we are really just referring to the one true God, who is the uncaused creator of everything. And Christians will say that is the God of Christianity. And so Muslims, even though as such their God doesn't exist really within reality, their worship that's offered to Allah within their religion is really offered to the one referent, who is the one God in Christianity. So what needs to be done here is then showing actually no. What worship, as understood in the way that we will say, is just ultimate ultimate reverence of a certain being. So I'm just using a very basic concept here. So it'll be ultimate reverential directed actions and actions towards a being. So you have reverence and it's ultimate reverence. So it's not just a small form of reverence, but you're directing certain actions towards this being. Now, this could be mental actions, your beliefs. This could be physical actions through your prayer, whatever it is. But you're directing yourself towards this being in a reverential form. Mm-hmm. Now, what I then try to show is that actually, when we understand what reference is in a contemporary context, we will actually realize that there are two referents here. Because what Catholics are trying to say is that there's only one referent, there's only one thing that's really being directed to. Even though you have these two religions, they're really directing towards one thing. Now, what I try to show is that this is not the case. And so the way that I unpack this is by utilizing contemporary philosophy of language built upon a person called Saul Kripke, who's a very, very famous, he passed maybe a few years ago now, but he passed away, but a very, very famous, influential philosopher in many different areas of philosophy of language, metaphysics, where he sort of tried to rethink what it means for us to use a name. Now, again, do stop me if you want any breaking down now or any more questions, sure. But I do need to sort of unpack this a little bit more. Hopefully you're with me. Okay, so in philosophy of language, normally the traditional view in the 20th century was when we use a name for something, it really just is a shorthand for a description. So, for example, when we use the name Aristotle is a name for a being, speaking about an ancient Greek philosopher. Now, in the early thinking on the matter about the nature of names, which we really don't do on a daily basis. You don't really sit down on your couch and say, "Oh, what does it mean for a name to really refer?" But it's actually quite important. But the early sort of way of thinking about this was called the descriptivist view. So it's a descriptivist theory of names. And it was held by people like Bertrand Russell, by Frege, so these sort of influential philosophers. And it was the idea that a name is just a shorthand for a description. So the name Aristotle just is the reason why it refers to a certain being is because there is a being that fulfills a certain description, being the ancient Greek philosopher who was a student of Plato and also was a teacher of Alexander the Great. So you have this certain description. Mm-hmm. And so when we use a name, according to this descriptivist view, we're just really applying a description here. And so when there is no description, when there's no being that fulfills a description, then there is no, the name doesn't refer to anything within reality. So for example, a unicorn could be a horse with a horn. Okay, just go with that. And because there is no being within reality that fulfills that description, the word unicorn doesn't really refer to anything within the actual world. And so this was the descriptivist view. But then Saul Kripke came along in the 1970s, and he basically pushed back against the consensus and said, this seems to be problematic because we seem to be able to use names all the time without actually really having any idea about the description of a being. So, for example, my name is Josh. My kids, even though they call me daddy, but let's say they use they were angry with me one day and they said, Josh. Yeah. And so they're able to refer and use that name, or if they were using that name in conversation and someone said, what is your daddy's name? And they said, oh, it's Josh. They don't really have a description in their minds about me. Oh, Josh is a philosopher who writes books, is married to his wife Priscilla and has 3 kids and blah, blah, blah. Like they don't have a description of me in their mind. They just know that there's this word, Josh, this name, and it refers to a being within reality called Josh. And so the idea that Kripke was saying, in reality, we don't really have any mental descriptions when we use names. And a lot of the time, we actually might be mistaken. So, for example, when someone uses the name Aristotle, someone might not know he was actually the teacher of Alexander the Great. A lot of people didn't know that. Some people might not know that he was a student of Plato. They just might know, oh, he was a guy who living in speaking about this weird stuff in ancient Greece. But we're still able to use that name to refer to Aristotle, even though we don't have a description in our mind. So Kripke pushed back and said, actually, descriptivism doesn't work. we have to use a different form of reference. And this is called the causal theory of reference he put forward. And basically, there are two stages. And the reason why I'm unpacking this, because this is very important in sort of some of the philosophers who have been defending the Catholic position, they are using this Kripkean form of reference to defend their position. And I'm going to show that it's incomplete and doesn't work without certain modifications. And so Kripke, he basically put forward this with Putnam, a guy called Hilary Putnam and a few others. He put forward something called the causal theory, or the causal historical theory of reference. And in the most basic sense, there's two stages to the way that a name can refer to something, or it refers to a being. First, there is something called a baptism. Now, take out your mind anything to do with Christianity. It just basically means a naming event. So when you have a kid, for example, you'll name your kid. So my parents named me Josh. And so they would pick me up and say, oh, he's called Josh. And that was my baptism in this sort of philosophical sense, where they gave me a name and the name now stuck to me. That was my name. And then how people can start using the name is not because they have this description, oh, there is a guy called Josh who was born X, Y, and Z. It's just literally because we communicate and we share this name. Oh, my mother will go and tell her sister, oh yeah, I called my son, your nephew, Josh. My auntie will go and spread it to someone else, and someone else will spread it to someone else, and someone else will spread it to someone else. And so names sort of stick to people because there is a causal link between individuals. So there's a baptism event where parents or whoever it is name the thing what it is. Right. And then from that point on, there is a causal link between people and other people. That's why the name refers. And so the reason, even though I don't have a description in my mind, so long as I am connected to this causal link where someone told me that this person is called Josh and I now start using it, I can correctly refer to this individual. And so this is sort of the causal theory. It's very simple, just saying there's a baptism event where there's a naming event, and then the name sort of just spreads down this causal link historically. And this is just how names are able to refer to things. Now, what people have done at the moment, they've basically said that, okay, so I'll give you the picture when it comes to Christianity and Islam. So Christianity and Islam both come from, let's say, Abraham. So Abraham is the sort of, let's say, prophetic founder of Christianity and Islam as such. It stems from him. And so let's say there was a naming event where God himself came and said, hey, I am God, to Abraham. Okay. And no one names God. So he named himself. And he said, I'm God. No one else is God. I am God. Hear, O Israel, there is one God and I am him. Okay. And that was the baptism event. And then from that point on, the word God was now communicated historically within the Jewish faith. So people were saying, oh, God showed up to Abraham. Oh, and blah, 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 passed on to someone else and passed on to someone else and passed on to someone else. And so the word God stuck to the specific being that is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so it was baptized by, let's say, God himself, and then it was passing down this causal link unbroken. And then Christianity came along later on. And because of the revelation of Jesus Christ, there was further things which were revealed to us about the nature of God, such as God being a father. And so people started saying, oh, yeah, there is a God and God is a father. Okay. And that was added to this. But because even though there was a modification to the understanding of God, because a name doesn't rely upon a description, it doesn't matter that other things were added to it. And so then later on in the 6th century, later on you have Islam coming about. And Islam adds further things to God. And they maybe say, God is, there's only one God, there's this and this and this. But they also come out and say, God does not beget, neither is he begotten. Yeah. Now, this appears to us to be contradictory because in the causal link, we have part of the community, the Christians who are part of the Abrahamic community, saying that God is a begetter. But then we also have later on where part of the community, again, because remember, it's just one united community with these causal links going down, where now the Muslims who are part of the Abrahamic community say, no, God is not a begetter. Now, what people have said is because even though there are these contradictory things which are said of God, because the key aspect of the reference, this theory of reference, is the baptism and the causal link. It doesn't matter that these things are contradicting at all. They're still referring to the same being. And so even though Christians have added to the Judaic view and said that God is a father, and then Muslims added to the Judaic view, the Abrahamic view, that God is not a father, because Christians and Muslims are all tied to the baptism event by this causal link that comes down from Abraham to the followers of Jesus and then the followers of Muhammad, it doesn't matter that there are contradictory beliefs and descriptions, because they are part of this descriptive event. Sorry, they're part of this causal history. They are still referring to the same being. They're still connected to that same being. So it's, again, for example, if just to help people understand, if a community of followers of Aristotle started saying Aristotle, oh, I don't believe Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great. Yeah, and then other people later on said, no, I do. I've looked at evidence that he's not. And so you have these two sort of parts of the communities. But they would say, oh, it doesn't matter. We're still talking about the same being. We're just disagreeing about some characteristics as such. And so because the key thing that maintains the reference that you're referring to the same being is that there is a causal link from the baptism event that's connecting these members of the community when they're using their referring terms, it doesn't matter that there are descriptive contradictions. Now, this is a widely, okay, maybe I wouldn't say widely held, but it is a very influential view. But there was also a very influential modification that was made, which a lot of Catholic scholars haven't, or people of Catholic apologists haven't actually taken into account. That actually shows that their position is incorrect. And this is what I do in the paper. I bring in a person called Gareth Evans, who was a very influential logician and philosopher in general. But he noticed something that was problematic about Saul Kripke's view, because he agreed with Kripke and said, definitely descriptivism is wrong. Okay, I agree with you that reference sticks. You fix reference on a being, on an entity by its being given a name, and then there being a causal link between people through communication. That's how you fix them. So we know who we're talking about because someone named this being and we communicated like this about this being. But then there was a question that was raised. Well, can a name over time change its reference? So it seems to be quite clear that there can be times when you're just not talking about the same being anymore. That even though you're using that name is not picking out the same thing. And so Gareth Evans said, if you just go with what Kripke has said, you don't have a way to make sense of something called referential drift, where the reference term, the referring term, the name, picks out something else over time, and it stops referring to that thing that was originally called whatever it was. And so you can see this with an example. So this is actually a historical example. So Marco Polo, who was an influential explorer, he mistakenly believed something about Madagascar. Now, Madagascar, the name Madagascar, used to pick out or refer to a part of mainland Africa. So that's what it used to be used by the community that was using the term Madagascar. But then Marco Polo, through, I think, translation problems or something like that, he actually thought that Madagascar refers to an island next to Africa, not to mainland Africa itself. Mm-hmm. And because of his influence, and when he was writing his things, he started referring to Madagascar as an island. And then over time, the name Madagascar stopped referring to mainland Africa and started referring to the island, even though the original community was using the term Madagascar to refer to part of mainland Africa. Now, what happened here was that there was a split in reference. Those who are still living in mainland Africa are still using the word Madagascar to talk about their specific part of Africa. But then those who now are explorers, and let's say years and years after Marco Polo, they arrive on this island and they say, oh, this is Madagascar. And no one will correct them. They will say that's correct because of the way that the community over time came to start using that term differently. And so what you have here is a split in reference. So now some people are using the word Madagascar for mainland Africa, and some are using it for an island. And so there are two referents here, even though there's the same word being used. Or another one, and this is a one that people might be able to latch onto. Think about the name Santa Claus. Now, if I use the name Santa Claus, okay, and obviously more specifically, you'll use the name Saint Nicholas when you're referring to the saints. But
Sure.
I can still refer and say, hey guys, do you know that there was a guy, actually historical individual called Santa, a historical individual that we refer to as Santa Claus that actually used to help people out. And people say, what are you talking about? Santa Claus is a fictional being. Now, I'm right in to say that there was a historical individual that we use the term Santa Claus for. And we use another name more specifically called Saint Nicholas, but we can still refer to him as Santa Claus. And so what the idea here is that there was, again, a split in reference. Originally, the name Saint Nicholas, or the individual that we were picking out with the referent Saint Nicholas, was referring to a specific person who was a historical individual who maybe slapped Arius, we don't really know, okay, but more than likely didn't. But there was an individual who was helping people and giving gifts to people. But then later on, there was a descriptive change to this individual, that it's actually not so much a historical individual, but an individual who can do magical feats. And so when we say actually there is an individual called Saint Nicholas, or there's an individual called Santa Claus, we are using that term in two different ways. Well, there's a referential split here. We're referring to one historical being, and we can also use a term to refer to this sort of magical person. Now, there are many other examples that we can give, but the key point that Evans was trying to say is that it's not sufficient just to hold to reference that the referent actually fixing who you're talking about by just a baptismal event and a causal historical link. You have to have three things. You have to have the baptism event where someone names the thing what they are. You then have a causal link where people communicate about what that thing is. But then there's also something called a dominant source of information, which is basically the community that's using the name. They have sort of an information file about what that being is. So with, for example, when it comes to Madagascar, you had a baptismal event by people who called it mainland Africa, a part of mainland Africa. People were then communicating about it. But then there was also something called a dominant source of information, which basically you can just think about is like a file. Let's say the community had a file and they had the Madagascar file. And when they opened it up, they'll say, oh, okay, this is a part of mainland Africa. It has this amount of people. It has this, it has this, it has this. So there'll be certain key information about what it is that we're referring to when we speak about Madagascar. But then what happened is that Marco Polo, through using the name Madagascar incorrectly to refer to an island, he changed that information file. He rewrote it. And so now, even though he was using the name Madagascar, when you now open up the file in Marco Polo's bag, you would see that it says, oh, an island with less amounts of people and X, Y, and Z. And so you'll have different information than what the community had. Now, when this sort of dominant source of information, when it's rewritten, and it's rewritten and affirmed community-wide, that's when reference splits. That's when a name can now take on, can fix on another entity. Mm-hmm. So with the word Madagascar, because Marco Polo was famous, people read his works, the European community, they now started using Madagascar to refer to the island, while the original African community were using it to refer to mainland Africa. So there was now a split in the referential term. And now the term Madagascar, even though it's one word, it was referring to two different things, mainland Africa and an island. And so basically, so there's so much to unpack here, and I know I've been speaking for quite a lot, but
no, that's fine.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna bring it home with sort of the Christianity and Islam part. But the key point here is that what Evans brings is this information file sort of aspect, that you can't just have baptism, you can't just have the causal link as people have affirmed, but you have to have a way to track that entity over time. How do we know we're really talking about that same thing? Well, because it has these key features. It has this, it has this, it has this, it has this. And so it's the same thing with the Santa Claus example. Santa Claus or St. Nicholas was a historical individual living in the 4th century who did X, Y, and Z. Then, over time, a different part of the community, the wider community, they rewrote that that file, and that file now didn't have historical individual living in the 4th century, but had a magical person living in the North Pole, blah, 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 blah. And so because that information now that was held by that community started to spread widely, what there was now a referential split. Right. Where now the term, if you use Santa Claus, St. Nicholas, or whatever you're going to use, that's going to pick out two different beings. One community, maybe the academic community, will say, actually, no, when we talk about Santa Claus, we're talking about this historical being. And then the general community, we say, no, when we're talking about Santa Claus, we're talking about this fictional being. But what you have is the term is just referring to two different things. So
that's a great example. Like I really like that Santa Claus one. So you're saying in this case, we'll need baptism, then the link, the keeping that causal link, and then you would say the dominant source of information. That's
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's this sort of, the dominant source of information. It's just a key fact that the community has about this specific thing that we're referring to.
Yeah. But what if a community is maybe like a minority or doesn't really have, like, does that change at all? Or is it just a matter of whoever starts bringing a lot of these key elements, it then becomes a split of two different people?
No, so it depends really, because the key point here is that reference is a social practice. Okay. And so you can have let's say a small split, and you can have a more general split. So for example, if Marco Polo, he started using the word Madagascar for the island, what he did is that he rewrote the file for himself. So he was using the term Madagascar not for an island, and so there was a split for him. So he wasn't, or not actually a split for him, there was a drift, there was a change in reference from the mainland Africa to the island. And so what happened here was basically the term now, because he basically rewrote the file personally, he was now referring to the thing differently than what the wider community would have. And so what can happen is if I can, let me take a few steps back, because there's two key concepts I want to bring in to then answer this. So this is then, and I bring this in the paper as well, the revised version, about ignorance and negation. So the key point here is that people can be ignorant of something, ignorant of how a term is used, and still refer to that thing. So someone could say, for example, that so let's go with the Superman one that's sort of going around a lot. So
Superman, Clark Kent.
Yeah, and Clark Kent. Yeah. So Lois Lane, she is ignorant of the nature of Clark Kent, what his real nature is, because he is in disguise. And so even though she might be saying, for example, oh, I see Superman flying around, I heard that he's an alien. Oh, it's so good that you're not an alien, Clark. You know, so good that you don't fly. I like you being at home with me and not taking care of these people. Now, unbeknown to her, Clark Kent is Superman. So he is an alien and he's not a human. So, but her term, Clark Kent still picks out, or Superman still picks out the same thing because of her ignorance. Because ignorance doesn't rewrite the dominant source of information. Basically, the idea here is that Gareth Evans says, when you're ignorant, the key point, Gareth Evans says, the key thing here is about intentionality. When you're ignorant of something, you're not intending to negate something that the community holds to when it comes to the referring term. So, for example, if Clark was to remove his disguise and start flying up, her beliefs about who Clark Kent is will change. She will no longer say, oh, Clark is actually a human being. She'll no longer say these things. And so what would happen here is that there will be no change in the reference. Before he revealed himself, she was referring to the same thing. After he revealed himself, he was still referring to the same thing. But why that was the case, why she was able to refer to the same thing, even though she was saying two contradictory things, Clark is a human and he's not a human because he's an alien. Clark is can fly and he cannot fly. Even though she was saying these contradictory things, because she was not intending to negate the dominant source of information that the community had about who Clark really was, let's say the Kryptonian community and everyone, she latched on to the dominant source of information. So I'll break this down a little bit more. So let's say you have a kid. A kid might say, "Oh, Dad, have you seen this magical thing in the sink that comes out, from the taps? My friends called it water, and it's just I believe it's this magical, this magical liquid that just comes out and is really refreshing." Now, obviously, water isn't magical; it doesn't have those features. But we would say if my daughter said, "Oh, I believe water is a magical substance," and someone said, "No, I believe water is H2O." My daughter, when she just says water is a magical substance, she would still be referring to the H2O. The reason why is because she is ignorant. So her ignorance is not intentional. So what she really is doing, she's deferring to what the true essence of that thing is by her not intentionally trying to say the thing is different. But however, if you had someone who said, "I believe water is a magical liquid," and then someone said, the science teacher said, "No, water is just a natural substance called H2O," and then the person doubled down and said, "No, I do not believe it's H2O. I believe," and I use the word water for a magical liquid. Now, what has happened is something called negation. Now, negation is where you rewrite the dominant source of information, where you intentionally negate something which is widely accepted to be the key facts of the thing you're referring to. And that is when reference can split or it can drift to something else. And so at a personal level, if I said to you, water, and I came back and said, "No, water is not H2O, it is a magical substance," then when I use the word water, I'm not referring to the same thing as when my science teacher uses the word water. I'm referring to something different. I'm referring to something which is false, which doesn't really exist. It's an empty term, but I'm not using the word water in the same way. If my daughter said water is a magical substance, but she's ignorant, then you don't have that because she's just deferring to this because she will be easily corrected. If I just said to her, no, actually, dear, water is actually not a magical thing. It's a special thing that we have all over the planet, but it's something natural. And later you're going to learn that it's made up of hydrogen and oxygen. And she says, okay, and she just accepts it. Then that will show that she wasn't negating something which was really essential to that referring term. And so the key thing is here, ignorance preserves reference. So if you're ignorant of something, you can still be referring to the same thing as someone else who's not ignorant. But if you're negating something, you're not going to refer to that same thing anymore. And why you're not is because you're rewriting the key information about that thing. Now, that could be at the personal level with the kid that says, no, water is the magical substance and doubles down. But let's say the kid now became the president of the United States and started teaching people and was really influential, started saying, water is this magical substance. Don't listen to these scientists that are lying to you, blah, blah, blah. And the communities now started to believe that water is a magical substance and started using water to refer to this thing called a magical substance. Then at the community level, the dominant source of information will now be rewritten. And what you will have at the community level is a split now in reference. The scientists, when they use water, they're using it for H2O. When the general public use water, they're using it for this magical substance. So the key point here is that ignorance preserves a reference, negation doesn't. But when you negate, it can happen at a personal level, that when I'm just talking about it, I'm talking about something different. Or if it's widely held to, it can then happen at the community level. It can happen at the more general level, that people start using the term differently. And this is what you see with the Marco Polo example. He was using it personally, and then it got caught on with the Europeans, and they started using it widely. So now when you open up a map or whatever, you'll see Madagascar maybe speaking about this island. And so there was a split at the community level now because of the influence that happened. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's good. Yeah. That is good stuff, man. Because I was going to, speaking on that, I was negation. I was actually going to then ask you about the Jews, but we could kind
Yeah,
of wrap that one
yeah,
real quick. But yeah, I
yeah.
mean,
We can go to that. I'll let me just now bring it home with the whole debate, and then
sure,
I can
yeah,
actually go to the Jews because it links to this. So, so what you now have is, let's say we go back to that picture that I drew earlier of baptism causal link for the Abrahamic faith. And so you have God going, naming himself God or Yahweh or whatever it is, as the Tetragrammaton. So whatever term you want to use to refer to the sovereign being of all, the one ultimate creator of everything. And let's say we just use the word God. And so God undergoes this baptismal event. And so the baptismal event is saying God is referring to the God of this specific nation, Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then over time, the word God is now communicated through this causal link that people are using the word God. And then Christians, then through their revelation that they found through the person of Christ, now update the Abrahamic dominant source of information, the file. And so they don't just add to the file. So the file doesn't just say uncaused creator of everything, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but also the eternal generator of the Son and the Spirit. And so Christians now add to they update the dossier, the file, the dominant source of information for the Abrahamic community. And so now when Christians are referring to God at that specific point, let's say in the first century, they are referring to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God of the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And so what they have here is that they've updated the file. Okay. Now, Islam then comes along, and Islam comes, let's say we just assume that it's connected to Christianity, and other people might push back on this, but let's just say we assume it. So there's a causal historical link between the Abrahamic faith when it comes to Christianity and then Islam. And so Muhammad comes around the 6th century and starts preaching in the latter part of the 6th century, going to the 7th. And he reveals something which says, Allah does not beget, neither is he begotten. Okay. And so now he and his community have now updated the file. They've updated the file by saying that, the Abrahamic file, the dominant source of information said, uncaused God is the referent God fixes on a being who is the uncaused creator of everything, the father of Jesus, the eternal generator of the Son, Jesus, and he begets, neither is he begotten. And so obviously, what happened there is that you have two contradictory things. One, you have there that he eternally begets the Son. You have there that he doesn't eternally beget the Son. And so what's happened now is that the community now of Christians and Muslims, they now have a dominant source of information which is contradictory. And so what we really have is that there's now a split in the dominant source of information. The dominant source of information for the Christians in the Abrahamic community is saying that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and also the Father. He is the eternal generator of the Son. But then the dominant source of information for the Muslims is saying that he is the uncaused creator, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as such, but he is not the eternal generator. And so what you have here is a split at the level of the dominant sources of information. And if you have two dominant sources of information, which then are held at a community level, then that term God isn't referring to the same thing anymore. Because remember, the dominant source of information allows us to track what the name is actually fixing on, what we're talking about. And if the dominant source of information is saying that it's the uncaused eternal generator of the Son, then it's picking out that being who's the uncaused eternal generator of the Son. But if that term God is, and we're using it to refer to a being again, and it's actually referring to a being who is the uncaused creator but is not an eternal generator, then it's fixing on a different being, a different referent. And so this again harkens to that Madagascar example. It's similar to that thing. You had, let's say, the Christians, who are the people who are living in mainland Africa, they're referring to God to speak about this specific thing, okay, like mainland Africa and the Father. But then later on, an influential person comes along and says, actually, no, that's not correct. I'm using the term to refer to this opposite thing. This being who's not the eternal generator, and at the Madagascar level, we're talking about an island here. And remember what happens. There is a split in reference now. So one community is talking about the Madagascar as a mainland Africa, and one is using it as an island. The same way now, Christians are using the term God for the Father, and Muslims are using the term God for Allah, who is not the Father. And so you're talking about two different referents, the same way that you have mainland Africa and this, or you have Santa Claus and this. So what you have here is a split in reference. So what you really have are two referents. And why this happens is because Muhammad did not do this with ignorance. If he just was ignorant and said, was mistaken and said, oh, I believe that God is not the Father, and then he was corrected by the Christians. I said, oh, yeah, that's correct. Sorry, I must have been, possessed by a demon to say this Quranic verse, or I must have been confused, or blah, blah, blah. Actually, no, Allah does beget. He does beget. Then you would have that causal link being maintained. But because Muhammad actually negated an essential component of the dominant source of information for the Christians, which is that God is a father, you didn't have an ignorance thing here. You had something where he actually rewrote the dominant source of information. And so that's where the split occurred. And so what you have here are two referents. And so now when it comes to worship is, if you remember, I was saying it's a directed form of reverence. You're directing reverence towards a certain thing. But if I'm using my term and I'm saying, I'm a Muslim and I'm praying to Allah, and I'm a Christian and I'm praying to the Father, because those terms, and I'm using God for both those terms, God and God, and I'm using those two terms, when I'm directing my worship towards God in Christianity, because the referent, the term fixes on something which is different, my worship is directed to something different. Because the referent is for Muslims is speaking about something which is different again, and my worship is directed towards that thing that's different. And so the key point here is, because there are two referents, worship cannot be had of the same being. So what we have here are two things that are being worshipped: the God, God in Christianity, and God and Allah, who's a different being in Islam. Now, just last thing here, sorry. So now, obviously, Christians will say there's only one of them who exists. So Christians will say that they're directing their worship, their thoughts towards the actual thing that exists, whilst the Muslims are using the term God as an empty term. It's not really referring to anything or picking anything out in reality, but they're two different referents anyway. Now, when it comes to the Jews, this is where it gets interesting. So the position I take, and I do this in the paper, I say that you have to be more specific about what you mean when you're talking about Judaism or Jews, because Judaism hasn't been monolithic throughout its history. And so what I do in the paper is I make a split between first/second temple Judaism and rabbinic Judaism. And they're very two different forms of Judaism. First and second temple Judaism was a compatible form of Judaism with Christianity. Rabbinic Judaism is incompatible with Christianity. And so what we have here, let's say that Abraham, Moses, all of the first temple Jews and the second temple Jews, they didn't know, those who weren't followers of Christ, they didn't know that God was a father in the sense that they didn't eternally generate, but they were ignorant. So even though that they were using the term God to pick out a being, and maybe they didn't know that God was a father, they were still referring to that specific being, because the community in general, let's say now we go to the second temple community.
I think I lost you. Dr. Joshua.
Hey, Justin, you okay? Can you hear me?
We lost connection there.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. Apologies. I'll just pick up from where I was going. Okay, guys. Just picking up from what I was saying. So the issue that you have with the Judaism objection here is that the first and second temple Jews were in a state of ignorance. And we would say that as Christians because there was need for revelation, and that revelation was provided through the person of Christ. And so what you had here with the first temple Jews, they were in a state of ignorance, but they were still referring to the Father when they were offering their worship. And so because of ignorance, again, allows you to defer to the dominant source of information of the community. And so you're within the causal link still. You can still refer to the same thing even if you are mistaken about your beliefs. But then there's a difference, though, that happens with rabbinic Judaism, because rabbinic Judaism is predicated upon actual rejection of Christianity and Christian teaching. And so we have various statements by influential individuals and authoritative sources, which states that God is not Trinitarian, that has various things that sort of go against the idea that God can eternally generate the Son, and about the incarnation as well. So you have here an actual negation of the dominant source of information for the community of rabbinic Jews. And so what you have here is, again, there's sort of I would say a split in reference, similar to the Islamic issue. But this one would be that the first and second temple Jews, they were referring to the person of the Father in their worship. I would say rabbinic Judaism is not, because it's now using the term God to refer to a different being. It's rewritten the dominant source of information, similar to Islam. So what Christians have to be committed to is that the Jews that were referred to in the scriptures were worshipping the God of the person, the God of Christianity. And that's what you can do within this model, because you are saying, no, they were in ignorance. And so they were worshipping, even though they had these mistaken beliefs. But there was no negation. If Abraham was corrected, if God came to Abraham and revealed to him, said, I'm a father, I eternally beget the son, I don't think Abraham would say, no, God, of course not. How could that be the case? They wouldn't do that. A Muslim would do that. They'll say, no, this must be a demon that says this because the Quran says this. Or even a rabbinic Jew will say, no, this cannot be the case. And so they would be easily corrected. And sorry, just two more points on this. How you can also see this evidentially is because there was no need to rewrite the beliefs of the Jewish Christians. When Jews became Christians, they didn't have to update their belief about God. They didn't change. They didn't have to say, reject their belief and say, no, God is not a father. And they had to distance themselves from that. Where there was debate was about salvation, about circumcision, about acceptance of Gentiles. But there was no debate about, but Abraham didn't worship the Father. Christians do. How could this be the case? And so there was a compatibility between First and Second Temple Judaism and that of Christianity. But when it comes to Rabbinic Judaism, look at how Rabbinic Jews treat Messianic Jews. Rabbinic Jews treat Messianic Jews very, very differently. They very explicitly in their authoritative sources say that they say Messianic Judaism is not proper Judaism. There is actually very explicit statements that it's not. God is not Trinitarian. You cannot be a Messianic Jew and call yourself a true Jew as such. So you can see that there is a negation of this. There's an incompatibility, and I do bring this in the paper for those who want to read it. Okay, now just the last bit that I would speak about, which I spoke about in the paper as well. You'll have an objection from Orthodox sources where people would say, well, aren't the Orthodox in the same camp as Catholics here? Because we have various patriarchs who have come out and said, in their statements that there's a worship of the same God for Christians and Christians and Muslims. I would say no. The reason why is because the way authority works within Orthodoxy and Catholicism is very different. Yeah. Orthodoxy is based upon, and I'm drawing from the work of Craig Trullier here, a very good book, The Rise of the Papacy, Rise and Fall of the Papacy. And he uses a terminology which captures exactly how Orthodoxy in the first millennium saw authority. There was a consensus-based epistemology and ecclesiology. And so how Orthodox operate is through consensus. And so things are binding for Orthodox when there's a consensus of the church on a matter. And this is normally expressed in a conciliar context. And so, for example, if there was a council of all of the Orthodox bishops who came together and declared that there is the same God of Muslims and Christians, then that will be something which is binding upon the consciousness of Orthodox. And so one patriarch coming out and saying something is not binding. That is something which is a personal opinion, a theological opinion that a certain individual has, but it doesn't have to be binding. And so Orthodox, based upon truth being discerned consensually in a conciliar context, and authority and declarative statements being done consensually, again, within a conciliar context. And so if a statement is made outside of those boundaries, then it's not actually something which is binding. So it doesn't matter if you just pick out one patriarch. Patriarchs do not have the same authority that Roman Catholics have. Roman Catholics are bound by canon law to assent to the teachings of the magisterium, infallible or not. So if the Pope comes out and says something at a teaching context, not in even the chair of Peter ex cathedra, but if he comes out and teaches something within a council, that is binding upon the consciousness of the Catholics. If a patriarch comes out and teaches something, that is not binding. That is something which needs to be taken on board because he is a patriarch, but it's not binding. And you can see this very clearly in the first millennium. Think about if it was the case that a patriarch of Constantinople comes out and says something, then we will all be Nestorians, because Nestorius was a bishop of Constantinople. He came out and was teaching that, you know, the son, he was teaching that against the Theotokos being the God bearer. And if it was that just a statement of someone coming out and saying this was the case, then we will all be Nestorians. That's obviously not the case, because it was only when the consensus of the church came together to declare something that is taken to be binding. And that hasn't happened with this, even though you've had influential figures in the church say things. They are taken as theological opinions, which should be taken on board and wrestled with, but they can be critiqued and corrected the same way that the church has corrected things like Nestorianism and other things like that. Last thing now with Gregory Palamas. Gregory Palamas, very influential, very important, very authoritative within Orthodoxy. And his teaching was also taken up in certain pan-Orthodox councils, which took his teaching to be authoritative for Trinitarianism, for Trinitarian thinking and general Orthodox thinking. So you cannot just put him to the side as you might be able to do with a patriarch or something like that, as such, because he is a saint in the church and he's also authoritatively received by the consensus of the church. However, you have to remember, when the councils did take on board what the teaching of Palamas to be authoritative was, that was his Trinitarian theology and also his understanding epistemologically concerning about the essence and energies distinction. Yeah. So it wasn't saying you have to take on every single thing on board that Palamas was stating, because he might not have been teaching things. So Palamas might have said something, and you could say, oh, because Palamas said this, okay, I need to hold this because the council said no, of course not. What was he declaring? What was he teaching? And he was within a context of debating and being oppressed by Muslims. And so obviously he was communicating with them, but he wasn't teaching authoritatively that that this was the position of a Trinitarian, that you have to hold to this, or to hold to the essence energies distinction, you have to hold to this. That wasn't the case. What the councils were affirming was that he's correct when it comes to the distinctions that he was speaking about and about his Trinitarian theology. And that's what needs to be received for Orthodox. And so again, just bringing up that councils affirmed it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case about every single thing that he said, because where do you draw the line about what should be taken on board or not? And also as well, sorry, last thing here, think about this in the first millennium. Gregory of Nyssa believed in a form of universalism. Does that mean that because Gregory of Nyssa's theology was received by the Council of Constantinople and it was received by the church, we have him even being stated that we should hold to Damasus and Gregory of Nyssa's theology? Does that mean that we also should affirm his universalism? Everyone would say, no, that wasn't the case. They were saying about his Trinitarian theology was what needed to be received, not necessarily every single thing that they were thinking about. Because again, people can hold to things that might not be correct at a church level. The church receives the consensus of the fathers as teaching that is then affirmed at a binding level. And so because a father might say certain things, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's taken to be binding on the consciousness of the Orthodox. So just want to say that Catholics and Orthodox are not in the same position here. So the challenge that I've raised in this article is a challenge for Catholics, because they have to affirm and they have to assent to the position that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. But if we understand what the two essences are of the two concepts that are put forward in the Christianity and Islam, and if we understand how reference actually works, and this is grounded upon a very widely accepted form of reference philosophically, there's a big philosophical challenge for someone to affirm that Christians and Muslims do worship the same God. No, they don't. They don't, and the church has affirmed that for a millennia and 2 millennia, and I would say that we have good philosophical grounds for doing that.
Wow, well said, Dr. Sijuwade. That was great. That was great, powerful stuff. I hope that any truth seeker, and for our Roman Catholic friends, that they really consider the depth of what you're saying here, because it is something that's binding from their vantage point, and hopefully their commitment to their faith and to truth, they'll push back on some of these things, and maybe you never know, they might look towards Orthodox Christianity. So yeah. I appreciate that, Dr. Joshua, man. We definitely got to do some more stuff together. I'd love to have you back, man. That was phenomenal.
Definitely. No, I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. And thank you for your questions as well. And thank you for just, being so charitable. And I really appreciate that. And I really look forward to coming back. We've got a lot more things to speak about. So I'd love to come back. Yeah.
Love that. All right. Well, Dr. Joshua, you have a good one. Thank you guys. Be sure to check out the link to that paper at the bottom of this video. You guys have a good one. Take care.